So this week we're going to be talking about conifers, as you probably expected, and we're going to stick to two of the three families that we looked at last week. The first plant that we want to look at today is Abies, or if you're European, you might pronounce it Abies. Abies grandis. Abies grandis is known as a grand fir, and it is grand. It's a big tree, can grow to 40 meters or 50 meters or so, and it has a very, very kind of statuesque trunk, and like a typical conifer in the Pacific Northwest, it has a conical and sort of columnar crown. But with grand fir, typically after 100 years or so, it starts to branch up high and creates these weird looking rounded tops. And maybe we'll get a shot of that. But the thing about grand firs is pretty easy to recognize. If you're in person, it has a very, very strong aroma. The genus Abies or Abies are known as the silver firs. If you flip the needles over, you see it's very, very bright on the back. And just like some of the other conifers we looked at, some of the other needle leaf conifers we looked at, you have these white waxy bands on the underside. And I'll just give a little bit of an explanation for that. The reason that they have those waxy bands is that the breathing pores, what we call the stomata, are on the backs of the leaves, and the wax helps to slow down the flow of water vapor out of the pores. So those waxy bands are very important. If they didn't have them, then the needles would lose water too quickly in a drought, and the needles would tend to burn out. In any case, this is an easy fir to recognize because it has strictly disticus needles. That is, you see two rows, one on either side, so a two-ranked arrangement, and very, very shiny dark green needles. If you were here in person, you'd be able to smell, it's a kind of a lemon cleanser smell about it. And this is used for Christmas trees. And some people don't like it because it smells so strongly of that sort of, I call it the sort of grapefruit peel and Mr. Clean, if that makes any sense to you. Now, when we do a close-up, you'll see that the needles are borne on a little petiole. That is, the green bit stops, and there's a little stem, and that stem attaches to the main stem by a little sucker pad. It looks like, if you've ever seen those pictures of the tropical tree frogs, it looks like the toe of a tropical tree frog. And when the needles are lost, they leave a little kind of donut-shaped scar, a little raised donut where they are. So not like a spruce, doesn't have a peg, it has a donut. So if you remember donuts for firs, for true firs, the silver firs, then you'll be well on your way. In terms of cones, we don't generally see the cones because they're almost always born right up in the very, very tops of the trees, and they look like giant cigars, about maybe 4 centimeters in diameter and 10 or 12 centimeters tall. And they stand straight up, and they break apart on the tree. They have imbricate scales because, of course, they're in the pine family. You know they have imbricate scales. But birds and squirrels and the wind basically tends to disassemble the cones. And so the only evidence of a cone will be on the ground in the forest. You'll see the remnants, all the cone scales basically scattered at the bottom of the tree. So this is not surprisingly, a member of the pine family. This is what's known as a true cedar, the genus Cedrus, and Cedrus, or Cedrus if you prefer. There are 3 species that we typically grow in the Vancouver area. Cedrus atlantica, which has short needles, Cedrus deodora, which is this, which has long needles, and Cedrus libanii, which has intermediate length needles. And so Cedrus libanii is the cedar of Lebanon. It's probably the one that people read about most, but it's the one that's least likely to be encountered in Vancouver. The one that's most common is the deodar cedar, Cedrus deodara. And there are 2 things about this that make it distinctive. One is the needles. They have what's known as a long shoot, short shoot morphology, and you might remember that from our discussion of ginkgo and a couple of other plants. But the long shoot, short shoot morphology, here you can see pretty obvious that these are the short shoots, little branches with tufts of needles, something in the neighborhood of 24 needles growing on each of these tufts, and these shoots only grow at a rate of about 1 millimeter a year. And so from looking at this, these are about 6 millimeters long or 7 millimeters long, so you can tell that these are 6-year-old short shoots. On the other hand, the tip of the branch, you'll find that the needles are arranged spirally in the way that they would be arranged on almost any other plant in the pine family. So the needles are very distinctive, and their growth is distinctive. But the second thing about Cedrus that is distinctive are the cones, and I'll get to the cones in a minute. But I want to describe the tree. The trees, Cedrus deodara, are very, very large trees, very, very strongly upright with excurrent branching. But as you can see from this, the branches droop at the tips, and that's very, very characteristic of the tree. So when you see it in the wild, or you see it planted in gardens, you see that the branches are very horizontal, but the tips droop downward. And so you have these long needles and downward drooping branches, and that's so that they can shed rain, and in fact, they're very good at handling snow, although they don't grow in very high snowfall areas, but they grow in areas where it does snow. And also at the tip of the tree, the top looks like that. It's not straight up as it would be on, say, a Douglas fir or grand fir, for that matter, but it has these kind of limp branch tips. So enough about that. Let's talk about the cone. I'm just going to grab a cone. And the cone is a spectacular thing. I think you would agree. We'll get a close-up so you can see the overlapping scales, very, very tight overlapping scales, and this beautiful sort of barrel shape to the cone. Now, again, like the true fir, like Abies, Cedrus have cones that are upright on the branch and that disintegrate in place. That is, they disassemble in place. And so this cone, which is just over a year old, is going to take another few months, probably another 6 months, and then is going to disassemble. So very, very distinctive. But a curious thing about Cedrus is that they produce their pollen and the start of the female cone in the autumn rather than in the spring, and that's unusual. And I'm just going to grab another cone. This time I'm going to grab the male cone, and you can see the male cone is quite substantial, and this has actually got is a little bit late to develop, and it still has some pollen going. So we'll play with that in front of the camera and see whether or not we can get some pollen out of that. So this is what we what we normally call the weeping yellow cedar, or the weeping Nootka cypress, or the weeping Alaska cedar, or the weeping Alaska cedar. It's got a whole bunch of names, and you'll find it listed under Cupressus nootkatensis, or sometimes Chamaecyparis nootkatensis, or sometimes Calotropis nootkatensis. And in fact, there are a few other names. It gets a little bit stupid. So we're sticking with Cupressus nootkatensis. Interesting thing about the name nootkatensis, that E-N-S-I-S ending always means from that place. And so you know it comes from a place called Nootka. And Nootka Sound is a place on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And in the I think it was in 1740 or something like that, Captain Cook, I believe, came up the coast and pulled into a sound, and the First Nations people there all came out to greet the English ship, and they all waved, and they were yelling "Nootka-e, Nootka-e," and so of course the English, figuring that the First Nations people were self-identifying, decided that they were saying, "Hey, we're the Nootka," and so the place was called Nootka Sound, and the people were called the Nootka. Subsequently, it was discovered that Nootka-e means "go around," because, of course, there were fairly serious shoals, that is, shallow water, and the people wanted to make sure that the English ship didn't run aground. So anyway, that's why it's called Nootka, Nootka cedar or Nootka cypress. We call it yellow cedar because the wood, the timber, is a beautiful kind of buttery yellow color, and it's one of the most commonly used woods for making masks along the coast. So First Nations use it for masks, and it's beautiful to carve. It's also used in shipbuilding because the wood of Cupressus, and in fact the wood of almost all plants in the cypress family, very, very oily wood, and it resists rotting. Okay, so enough about that. Let's talk about this particular plant. You can see that it has this drooping posture, and this is very typical of Cupressus nootkatensis pendula group, and that's what we're talking about today, is the pendulous forms of the yellow cedar. And the reason we're talking about that is that nobody generally grows the upright form because it's not really not a very attractive plant. But this is a bit of a novelty with its drooping branches. Now, with a close-up, you'll be able to see that it's a little bit like the Calocedrus, and in fact, a little bit like the Chamaecyparis that we saw last week. It has these long sprays of branchlets, and they're made up of overlapping, decurrent, decusately arranged scale leaves. And so we can probably leave it at that. A little bit rougher to the touch than some, and very, very fresh green at this time of the year. Kind of stands out in the landscape, but generally a kind of droopy plant, and so I consider a little bit sort of depressing, not really good for COVID times. But once people are happier, then maybe we'll start to see this used a little bit more frequently. Upright growth, the branches are more or less horizontal, and then the tips of the branches and the branchlets hang straight down. Now I want to show you some cones, but I think we'll have to do that in close-up because they're very, very small this year. I should talk a little bit about the ecology. These are forest trees, and they tolerate our cool, wet weather like we're having here, and they do very well in this. What they don't want is hot, dry weather in the summer. So these are sort of restricted to montane habitats and northern habitats where they can tolerate all that rain and snow. So this is another West Coast native. This is the Sitka spruce, Picea sitchensis. Sitka doesn't have as interesting nomenclatural history as Nootka. Sitka is actually a place in Alaska, and it actually, I think, is a legitimate name. But nevertheless, this is a tree that grows right up and down the coast. And if you go right out to the west coast of Vancouver Island, right where the Pacific blasts into the shore, this is the tree that forms the barrier right down the coast from Alaska right down to Oregon. You'll find this right in the way of the salt spray and high winds. As an urban tree, not such a great thing, but we talk about it because people are always interested in native plants and how to use native plants. And I want to make sure that you know that this is a big tree, that this is in some ways a problematic tree, but generally it's an attractive tree if you note that the undersides of the needles are this beautiful bright white, very much like the needles of Picea omorica. The difference between this and Picea omorica is couldn't be greater. In terms of the tree, this is not a narrow tree. This is a very broad tree, very, very substantial tree. It has needles that are very, very sharply pointed as well. They're flat in the same way that Picea omorica are flattened needles, but these are very sharp pointed. So you'd never confuse the two. Typically, for a spruce, of course, you have, once the needles fall, you have these little pegs all up and down the branches, and we'll show you those. The posture of the needles, they're spirally arranged. You notice that they're arranged all the way around the branch, and that's a sign that this is a plant that grows right out in the open. Typically, plants that are more shade tolerant have a kind of flatter branch profile. So this is a kind of radial phyllotaxy with needles. The cones, I have some cones. The cones are a little bigger than the cones of Serbian spruce, and they have a cone scale that's similarly overlapping, but the scales themselves are a little bit more sort of cupped and contorted. A very, very distinctive cone, quite an attractive looking cone. One of the great things about this plant, if we're looking at sort of restoration or a native forest, is that it tolerates not only salt and wind and full sun, but it also tolerates flooding. And this will grow where the ground is actually saturated for much of the winter. And that's actually a pretty useful thing in a wet climate, a winter wet climate like Vancouver's. This is what we call the shore pine, Pinus contorta, variety contorta. It's called Pinus contorta because, as you can see, there's a lot of curvature in the growth. This is pretty typical of all of the growth on the tree, and so while it is a tree rather than a shrub, it tends to form a kind of rounded top, and it often looks like a shrub on top of a stem, often a leaning stem. Now it's a two-needle pine. It's very, very similar, in fact, to Pinus mugo. If we were to just cut off a piece and cut off a piece of mugo pine and put them together, you'd be hard pressed to actually tell them apart. Both of them have pairs of needles that twist. They perhaps a little bit more twisted in Pinus contorta, but not always. They both produce the same sort of clusters of male cones behind the annual growth. They both have sort of white resin encrusted buds. The difference is really seen in the landscape, whereas Mugo pine tends to be very, very well branched and shrubby. Pinus contorta, variety contorta, is really a tree, and it has generally a single stem. And other than the fact that Pinus mugo produces cones regularly, and you may have noticed in last week's video that the cones typically radiate straight out, so horizontally from the stem, whereas in Pinus contorta, variety contorta, the cones generally are reflexed. That is, they point backwards on the branch. And I'm going to grab a cone, and this is an old cone. They're typically maintained on the tree for years and years. But you can see the posture of the cone. It's sort of hanging back. The cones are not dissimilar, maybe a little bit narrower on Pinus contorta, variety contorta. But like I say, difficult to tell them apart. What's similar about them, though, is they're both very, very adaptable plants. And so Pinus contorta, variety contorta, you would find, again, growing locally around Vancouver, growing in winter wet areas, in the lowlands, and forming trees to no more than about 20 or 25 meters tall with a rounded top. Very, very versatile tree. Mugo pine, similarly, not as tall, but a shrub you can grow almost anywhere, even in sort of seasonally flooded soils, although that's probably not the best place to grow those things. This is Austrian pine. Austrian pine is Pinus nigra, nigra meaning black, and this the name nigra comes from the fact that it actually has beautiful light-colored bark, but the fissures between the plates of light-colored bark are very, very dark and almost black. And so that's about the only thing that's black about the plant. Now, Austrian pine is ubiquitous around Vancouver, and in fact, across much of North America that's warmer than, say, zone 5. It is a very, very widely planted conifer because it is very, very predictable in its growth. It's not very large after about 25 years, which is how most people measure, what's large, and it's easy to grow and pretty uniform when nurseries grow it from seed. It's a 2-needle pine, but it's quite a substantial pine, much thicker in terms of its branching, and in terms of the length of the needles and the actual thickness in the needles, compared with, say, Pinus contorta or Pinus mugo. So fairly substantial needles. These are nearly 10 centimeters long, or maybe a little longer than that. And the cones are much larger, born at the base of the previous season's shoot. In fact, when we look at the tip of the branch here, we see the cones that will ripen next year. They're already starting to develop, and they got their start this spring. So it does take something in the neighborhood of 20 months, almost 2 years, for these things to ripen. So there's not much to say about Austrian pine. except that it's a very, very uniform grower. Nice rounded head, kind of ovoid crown, very predictable, as I say, and beautiful bark once it gets going. But I call it wallpaper because it's so common in Vancouver. It's like almost all the conifers you see in Vancouver, if you're not in a wild place, is Austrian pine. The cones have imbricate scales, of course all pines do, but the diamond-shaped pattern that's formed from the face of the cone scale, that is the visible face of the cone scale, which is called the apophysis, and I'll write that down for you. The apophysis is a kind of beautiful diamond shape, and when the cones are young, there's a little prickle at the tip of the apophysis, and that little prickle is called the umbo, or actually the base of that prickle is called the umbo. So that's pretty typical of a two-needle pine. Very, very easy to grow, grows in a range of places and environments. Doesn't like shade much, but grows very, very well in the Vancouver area. So this is our fourth and last pine. This is Pinus parviflora, and this is known as the Japanese white pine. Now the white pines as a group have typically softer needles than the two-needle pines or the three-needle pines. You haven't seen any three-needle pines, but they're also known as the two and three-needle pines are known as hard pines, and the five-needle pines are known as soft pines. They have much finer needles, and in fact the white pines, at least the cultivated white pines in Vancouver, all have 5 needles in a bundle. And you will have noticed that the bundles, they're actually technically called fascicles. A fascicle is more than one thing sort of stuck together, like in book binding. A fascicle is, if you ever ripped apart a book, you know that a good book is sort of sewn in groups, and those are called fascicles. In any case, this tree is native to Japan and Korea, where it grows. It can be a tall tree, but most of the time it's a sort of irregular tree, leaning stem, flat top, and it lends itself very well to a particular kind of pruning. So it looks very, very ornamental. It's a great tree in the not the residential, but maybe in the institutional landscape, because it's the right sort of size. It doesn't get too big. It's also very attractive with this sort of blue-green color, and the blue-green comes from the needles, which are green on top and blue on the back, or sort of whitish. And it also has these persistent clusters of cones that you see every couple of nodes. And the cones are shorter than most white pines. Most white pines have long, narrow cones, and that's why this is called parviflora, because that means short flower, or in this case, a short cone. So these nice sort of rounded or ovoid cones, and these tufted looking needles. The needles, on close inspection, you will see that they are curved, and there are 5 needles in a bundle. Unlike the hard pines, unlike the 2 and 3 needle pines, the fascicle sheath, that little, if you notice in the last pine we looked at, there was a little kind of a black base to the needles, and that's a little fascicle sheath. Those are actually leaves, but they're not photosynthetic leaves. In any case, they are persistent in the 2 and 3 needle pines and deciduous in the 5-needle pines. And so not that you needed any other way to tell them apart, because obviously 5 needles is different than 2 or 3 needles. They generally have very, very smooth bark until they get a little bit older, and then the bark gets very platy, and it's often very resinous, and so sticky, and the cones themselves are sticky. And we'll have a good close look at the cones. The cones are different on a 5-needle pine than they are on the hard pines. The umbo, if you remember the umbo, which was in the center of that little diamond-shaped apophysis, on a 5-needle pine, the umbo is actually like a thumbnail. It's right at the edge of the cone scale. Again, not that you need another way to tell those groups apart. This is Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menziesii. Douglas fir is a very, very important tree in commerce. It's probably the most valuable of all timber trees because it's used for house construction, and the wood has the right combination of flexibility and strength. And so the early wealth of British Columbia, and in fact the early wealth of Western North America, is built on the back of Douglas fir. Douglas fir is pretty easy to recognize. The exposed shoots, if you grow Douglas fir in the sun, the exposed shoots, the needles have a radial phyllotaxy. On the shaded shoots, they're more, they're not quite decusate, but they're almost two-ranked. And so you have everything sort of between those two extremes on a branch. I should say something about the shape of the tree. We have some very, very large Douglas firs at the Botanical Garden, and you can take a look at those. We'll shoot a couple. In profile, Douglas fir is easily recognized because it's not symmetrical. It has an excurrent habit and a very, very strong leading shoot, but the branches tend to be, sort of askew, not symmetrical. Now, that's one of the ways that we tell the difference between, from a distance, we tell the difference between, say, a Sitka spruce and a Douglas fir, is that the Sitka spruce will have beautiful, symmetrical branching, nice kind of upward-facing boughs, whereas Douglas fir is all over the map in terms of the length and the posture of those branches. Douglas fir is also easily recognized. Older specimens have very, very thick corrugated bark, very, very deeply fissured bark, very, very attractive. And the young stems are very smooth. The Douglas fir also produces needles that are flattened like a Sitka spruce, and they're pointed, but they're not sharply pointed, and so they're very easily handled. The way that they are attached to the stem looks a little bit like a spruce, but not quite. Once the needles fall off, there's no peg remaining, there's just a little bump. And it's like one side of the base was left when the needle fell off. And so you just have it's a little bit of a roughness there when you run your fingers along the old stems. Then right at the tip is a chestnut-colored pointed bud, and that's very characteristic as well. And when growth starts in the spring, all those little bud scales, those chestnut-colored bud scales, will fall to the ground. There'll be billions of them on the ground under a big Douglas fir. So, easily recognized by, well, most people recognize the smell, because if you grew up in North America, you'd be mostly having a Douglas fir as a Christmas tree. It's a very, very popular tree because in youth they can shear it and it forms a nice bushy crown. It's a little bit too loose for me. I prefer a true fir as a Christmas tree, but then you have to pay for that. What else can I tell you? The cones, male cones are ephemeral, little small male cones that in the spring shed their pollen, then they drop. The female cones develop, and they're very, very distinctive. Cones are like a spruce cone with the overlapping, the imbricate scales, but there's a bract that is pushed out from between the scales that has 3 points, and these are a little bit wet now. But with a close-up, you'll be able to see what these things look like. So Douglas fir grows naturally in the Vancouver area. It can tolerate summer drought with no problem and tolerate our winter moisture, but it always grows on well-drained soil in Vancouver. And so in the mountains locally, there's obviously good drainage on the mountain, but in the city, if you want to grow a Douglas fir, it's not going to grow where, for example, where Sitka spruce will grow. It needs better drainage. And the further south you get, the more Douglas fir, that is further south on the coast, the more Douglas fir becomes dominant until the heat sort of takes it out of them. Oregon is a very good place to see Douglas fir, as well as British Columbia. This is Thuya plicata. You might pronounce it Thuja, but most people pronounce it Thuya plicata. This is another conifer that's native to the west coast of North America, and this is another rainforest species. It is aromatic, not in the same way that Chamaecyparis or Caliscedrus are aromatic. This has definitely a sweet pineapple scent, which is really evident when you hang around, you bruise the foliage, or if you tear it up. It's a large tree and it's a long-lived tree. Western red cedars are known to live a couple of thousand years, and the wood, like all members of the cypress family, the wood is very valuable. And if you live in a house anywhere in North America that has a shake roof or a shingled roof, chances are it's Western red cedar that's on the roof. So that's one of that's one of its major sort of timber uses. It is a tree that is extraordinarily well adapted to a high winter rainfall climate. These branches are designed to shed, the branchlets are designed to shed water. And so it has these sort of curtain-like branches, very much like the Cupressus nutcatensis, very, very similar. And again, very similar alternating branchlets with scale-like decurrent decusate leaves that are arranged in flattened sprays. So how can we tell the difference between this and, say, Chamaecyparis or Cupressus? Well, we look at the cones, and whereas Chamaecyparis has cones that have valvate cone scales, Thuyas have cones with imbricate scales. Now, there aren't very many scales, and if you look closely, and if you were to dissect the cone, you would see that they're actually decusate scales. That is, each pair of scales at right angles to the next one inside. So there aren't that many seeds in there, probably a few dozen seeds in each cone, but there are literally millions of cones in a forest of Western red cedar. Western red cedar are notorious in gardens for lapping up moisture. It's very, very hard to grow plants underneath Western red cedar. They're very, very effective at capturing that water. And so they're very good as long as the soil is not too rocky and thin, they're very good at extracting moisture from depth, and so they can tolerate drought conditions. More so, for example, than the eastern white cedar, Thuya occidentalis, and we saw the cultivar smaragd last year. This will survive a typical Vancouver summer once it's established without irrigation, whereas Thuya occidentalis will not. This is, again, a very, very common hedging plant, Thuya plicata. There are a number of cultivars that are available that are very good. They're propagated and they're cheap and they grow fast, and so people plant them. Whereas smaragd doesn't need pruning, Thuya plicata definitely needs pruning and should be pruned probably a couple of times a year. Most people don't realize that when they first plant them, and they end up with a bit of a monster. Anyway, a beautiful tree immortalized, I think, by Emily Carr, who is a local painter of some renown. And it's probably worth looking at some of Emily Carr's paintings of conifers in the forest locally, just to get a sense of what it's like to be here in the winter. So this is the last conifer that I'm going to, this is the last plant. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about in the course. This is western hemlock, Tsuga heterophylla. Tsuga is a Japanese word, T-S-U-G-A. You pronounce both the S and the T, Tsuga. It's the Japanese name for another hemlock, a Japanese hemlock. But this is another Western North American tree. It's a very tall tree, can grow to over 200 feet, so probably 70, 80 meters tall. It's a brittle tree, and so it's relatively short-lived, whereas Douglas fir can last for 1,000 or 1,500 years or more. The Western hemlock typically only grows for 300 or 400 years, and then that's what we call short-lived in the forest, 300 or 400 years. Anyway, easily recognized in the field because the tip of the tree has a little crook in it, and that's because these branches are so flexible, very, very thin branches, and so the tips droop very much like in the same way that deodar cedar droops. So the tip and the branch tips also droop. But this is much more like Douglas fir in the way that the needles are borne. Only on the leading shoots will you have anything close to a radial phyllotaxy. Most of the tree, and this is a very, very shade-tolerant tree, most of the tree is very strongly disticus, as again, 2 ranked. But the name heterophylla refers to the fact that it has different length needles. And so if you look at any branch, you'll see a variety of leaf lengths on the branch. Now the cones, well, let me talk a little bit more about the needles. The needles are short and blunt, and very, very easily handled. They're very, very white on the backside, like most needle leaf conifers. They have those waxy bands on the back of the leaf. If you look very, very closely at the branches, and we may not be able to see that too clearly on a rainy day, but the branches themselves are hairy, and the leaves are a little bit hairy as well. You can't really see that from a distance, though. The cones are very, very tiny. The cones are very, very cute. They have just a few imbricate scales, spirally arranged imbricate scales, and they're about usually no more than 1 centimeter in length. So very, very cute cones, and they're produced by the thousand on a mature tree, but they're often hidden. And when we get the big winds that we do in November in Vancouver, then we find these little cones all over the ground in the forest. So lots and lots of hemlock cones. Hemlock is sometimes used to flavor beer, and they call it spruce tip beer, but they use hemlock instead of spruce. Now, I wouldn't go around eating the tips of hemlocks, but it actually is a fairly tasty thing to add to beer. And a great thing about it is that there's vitamin C in here, ascorbic acid. So if you feel like you're not getting enough vitamin C, you can always chew on a hemlock branch.